So we all know that the real estate market is undergoing some state of flux right now, let's say. Things are changing, and we're certainly seeing conditions back in offers. So what does this mean from a buyer's perspective, and what does this mean for a seller's perspective? Well, we're going to talk about that today. This is Curbside with Crystal. So before we get deep into the wild and crazy world of conditions, I invite you to follow me on social media and subscribe to my YouTube channels for more real estate related information, some helpful home tips, and so I know I'm not talking to myself. So let's get back to conditions. So yes, conditions are back more often than not, or at least sort of 50-50. So not something new, but something that we haven't seen on a regular basis in quite some time. So I thought we'd take some time today just to review them for those of you who might be new to the market and are not familiar with conditions. So the first two conditions that we see sort of most common is a condition on financing and a condition on inspection. So that's a home inspection. So even if you've got a pre-approval, the bank hasn't approved the house. They've approved your credit and they've approved your income, but they don't know what house you're buying yet, so they haven't really approved the house. So sometimes, in a lot of cases, it's good to put a financing condition in. So from a listing perspective, when I am the listing agent, I'm okay with seeing a condition on financing, because here's the thing. If the whole deal is going to fall apart at some point, say we've got a 60-day closing, I would rather it fall apart right now within the next 5 days, rather than find out a couple weeks or a couple days before closing that the buyer cannot get their financing. So I'm just going to read through very quickly, but it's very dry, what the typical financing clause says, the one that's used most often. So this offer is conditional on the buyer arranging at the buyer's own expense a new first charge or mortgage satisfactory to the buyer in the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. Unless the buyer gives notice in writing delivered to the seller personally or in accordance with any other provisions for the delivery of notice in this agreement of purchase and sale or schedule thereto, not later than 5 banking days after the acceptance of this offer that the condition is fulfilled, this offer shall be null and void, and the deposit shall be returned to the buyer in full without deduction. This condition is included for the benefit of the buyer and may be waived at the buyer's sole option by notice in writing to the seller as aforesaid within the time period stated herein. So that's a lot of words. So let's break this down. So first of all, before I move forward, the inspection condition is almost identical. All we do is we take out the first charge and we put in a home inspection. So very, very similar clauses, but let's break it down and sort of see what they say. So first of all, this offer is conditional on the buyer arranging at the buyer's own expense a new first mortgage or, again, an inspection. So first of all, what is that saying? So that's saying that the buyer has to arrange it. So the buyer has to pay for financing or get their own financing arranged. In the case of a home inspection, the buyer has to pay for their home inspection. And it has to be satisfactory to the buyer in the buyer's sole and absolute subjective discretion. So what does this mean here? So say, for instance, you say that you've been pre-approved at the CIBC, for instance, and for some reason they pull your financing and they say, no, we can't do it. And I, for instance, as the listing agent say, oh, don't worry, I got a guy, but he's going to charge you 20% interest. Well, this is where that sole and absolute subjective discretion comes. If those terms that are offered to you are not acceptable by you, then you do not have to accept them. So you've got to be okay with the terms that you're being offered by the lender. So, and then the next part, it has to do with communicating back to the seller. So the buyer has to communicate in writing, as it's talked about in the agreement of purchase and sale, whether or not they get their financing. So typically, and this needs to be done typically within 5 banking days. Now the 5 banking days, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. Sometimes it depends on, your relationship with your lender. If you've got a really good relationship, they can get it done fast. You can shorten that up, which really makes your offer more attractive, or perhaps in some situations you need a longer period. So ditto with the home inspection. A couple of years ago, our son bought a property in Sudbury, and we actually had to put in a 15-day inspection clause because we couldn't get a home inspector. I mean, they just don't exist up there. So it happened, and that's just what we had to do, and that was acceptable in the area. It was totally unheard of down here in Durham region, but that's how it works up there, and it was good with everybody. So that 5 days is a little bit flexible depending on the market, depending on your needs and different things like that. But typically it's 5 banking days. So again, banking days. What is a banking day? So it's Monday to Friday, no Saturdays, no Sundays, but no stat holidays as well. So if you've got Easter, Christmas, whatever stat holiday you're talking about, and whatever month you're buying the house, those are not included in the 5 banking days. So if you do not, as the buyer, if you do not move forward, your deposit shall be returned to the buyer in full without deduction. So if you decide that the home inspection isn't up to par for your liking, or you don't get your financing, you get your full deposit back without deduction. So there's no admin fees, there's no transaction fees or anything like that. That comes back to you. Now, depending on the listing brokerage, which is the brokerage that will be holding your deposit typically, it might take 5 days, it might take 10 days. It sort of depends on their policy in their office. Now, the last part is the condition is included for the benefit of the buyer and may be waived at the buyer's sole option by notice in writing to the seller, and yada, yada, yada. So again, we're all saying, okay, this is put in here for the benefit of the buyer. They want to do their due diligence, make sure all their ducks are in a row. But if they choose, for instance, not to do the inspection or to waive their financing, they can do so in writing. So there's a recap of your condition on financing and condition on inspection, which are very, very similar. There are other conditions that we see sometimes. Sometimes we're seeing a sale of buyer's property condition, but I'll cover that in another video. If you ever have any questions about the real estate market, are thinking about buying or selling, or all things real estate, just call Crystal. Talk to you soon.